I never expected to receive termination papers from my own brother. After Dad handed control of Morrison Family Motors to Garrett, everything changed overnight. Our Chicago car dealership had served the community for 40 years, built on honest service and customer relationships. I had spent decades nurturing these connections, but Garrett had different ideas. Aggressive sales tactics and profit maximization over everything I'd built. What Garrett didn't know was that within 3 weeks I would join Regional Auto Supply as Regional Distributor, controlling every parts shipment for dealerships across Illinois, including his. While he focused on aggressive tactics, I would systematically strangle his supply chain. He was about to learn that burning bridges has consequences. My name is Jason Morrison, and I'm 43 years old now. Morrison Family Motors in Chicago had been my world since I was 27 years old, fresh from college and eager to prove myself in the family business. I had started in the service department, learning every aspect of the operation from the ground up, just as our father had insisted. I remembered those early days when Dad would arrive at 6 in the morning, an hour before anyone else, walking through the showroom and checking every detail. He taught me that selling cars wasn't about moving inventory. It was about understanding people, their needs, their dreams, their limitations. Every customer who walked through our doors was someone's mother or father, someone's son or daughter, and they deserved to be treated with respect and honesty. Over the years, I had built relationships that spanned generations. Mrs. Patterson had been buying cars from us since 1995, and I knew that she preferred sedans in neutral colors because they reminded her of her late husband's practical nature. The Rodriguez family trusted us with their entire fleet of work trucks for their landscaping business, and I understood that reliability mattered more to them than luxury features. Old Mr. Chen came in every Saturday, not to buy anything, but to look at the new models and share stories about the cars he had owned over the decades. These weren't just customers. They were part of our community, part of our extended family. But as Garrett continued to outline his vision for the dealership's future, it became clear that he saw them only as numbers on a spreadsheet, data points to be optimized for maximum profit extraction. He told me that Dad's way of doing business was dying, that this was business, not charity. His voice took on the tone he had perfected in business school, confident and slightly condescending, as if he were explaining basic economics to a child. He stood up and straightened his expensive suit, the kind our father would have called too flashy for a car dealer, and informed me that he needed people who could adapt to the modern market. I felt my hands clench into fists at my sides as I tried to process what was happening. This was the same brother I had taught to throw a baseball in our backyard. The same kid who used to follow me around the dealership during summer breaks, asking endless questions about every aspect of the business. I had been the one to train him when he joined the company 5 years ago, fresh out of Northwestern with his MBA and grand theories about maximizing profit margins. I had shown him everything: how to read a customer's body language, how to listen for what they weren't saying, how to build trust through small gestures and genuine concern. I had taught him that a successful sale wasn't about pressure or manipulation, but about finding the right match between a customer's needs and our inventory. Most importantly, I had tried to help him understand that our reputation was built on the relationships we maintained long after the paperwork was signed. Now he was using that knowledge to justify throwing me away like yesterday's newspaper. I asked him about Dad's vision for the business, about the values that had sustained us through economic downturns and changing markets. Garrett's response was dismissive. He said that sentiment didn't pay the bills, that we needed to focus on metrics and efficiency rather than getting emotionally attached to outdated practices. He spoke about customer acquisition costs and lifetime value calculations as if human relationships could be reduced to mathematical formulas. The conversation that followed felt surreal, like watching someone else's life implode while I remained helplessly detached from the action. Garrett explained that he had already hired new sales staff with experience in high-pressure environments, people who understood that time was money and that every interaction with a customer should move toward a close. He had restructured the service department to focus on higher-margin repairs and had implemented new policies designed to increase the average transaction value. When I pointed out that these changes might alienate our long-term customers, he dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. He said that customer loyalty was overrated, that people would always choose the best deal regardless of their emotional attachments. If we lost some customers in the short term, we would more than make up for it by attracting new ones who appreciated our streamlined approach. I realized then that Garrett had never really understood what made our dealership special. He had observed the mechanics of our operation, the sales processes, the financing procedures, the service protocols, but he had missed the soul of what we did. He saw efficiency where I saw care, transactions where I saw relationships, profit margins where I saw trust built over decades. The walk out of that office was the longest of my life. I moved past the showroom floor where I had closed thousands of deals, each one a small victory built on understanding and mutual respect. The new cars gleamed under the fluorescent lights, their price stickers reflecting Garrett's aggressive pricing strategy. Everything looked the same. But somehow it all felt different now, tainted by the knowledge that the foundation beneath it was crumbling. I passed the service bay where I had spent countless hours talking with our mechanics, learning about common problems with different models so I could be more helpful to customers. Tony Ramirez, our head mechanic for 12 years, looked up as I walked by. The expression on my face must have told him everything he needed to know, because his shoulders sagged with disappointment and worry. The receptionist, Maria, had tears in her eyes as she watched me collect my personal items. She didn't need to ask what had happened. Word traveled fast in our tight-knit workplace. She told me quietly that nothing would be the same without me, that the customers would notice my absence immediately. I assured her that she shouldn't worry about her own job, that Garrett would need experienced people to help him implement his changes. But we both knew that everything was about to change in ways we couldn't predict. Other employees looked away as I passed, embarrassed and angry but powerless to intervene. These were people I had worked alongside for years, people whose families I knew, whose children I had watched grow up. Some of them had been with the dealership longer than Garrett had been alive. But in a family business, blood trumped loyalty every time. The drive home felt like a funeral procession. My mind raced with questions about how I would tell my wife Sarah, how I would explain that my own brother had stabbed me in the back without warning. At 43, I felt too old to start over somewhere else, too invested in this particular business to simply walk away and forget 16 years of my life. But as I sat in my car in the driveway, staring at the house Sarah and I had bought with the steady income from Morrison Motors, something began to change inside me. The initial shock and hurt were giving way to something colder, more calculating. Garrett thought he was so smart with his business degree and his aggressive tactics. He thought he could simply erase me from the equation and move forward without consequence. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Sarah took the news better than I had expected. She had never fully trusted Garrett's motives since he joined the business, often commenting that he seemed more interested in impressing his business school friends than in serving our customers. She held me while I explained what had happened, her anger on my behalf matching my own sense of betrayal. She asked what I was going to do next, whether I had any ideas about where to look for work. The automotive industry in Chicago was relatively small, and most of the other dealerships were either family operations like ours or parts of large corporate chains that wouldn't be interested in someone with my specific background. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that I needed time to think through my options. But even as I spoke those words, I was already beginning to formulate a plan. The call came 3 days later, while I was still trying to figure out what to do with the sudden abundance of time on my hands. Jim Patterson from Regional Auto Supply had heard about my situation through the industry grapevine. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit Chicago automotive dealer community, especially when it involved something as shocking as a family business firing one of its own. Jim's voice was sympathetic when he called, expressing genuine surprise and disappointment about what had happened. He told me that everyone in the industry respected my reputation and was puzzled by Garrett's decision. Then he mentioned that Regional Auto Supply was looking for a regional distributor for the Western Territory, someone with my experience and connections who could make a real difference in their expansion plans. As he explained the opportunity, I felt a spark of interest that had nothing to do with simple career advancement. The position would give me responsibility for managing relationships with dealerships across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana, a territory that included Morrison Family Motors. I would have control over supply chains and pricing for dozens of dealerships, with the authority to negotiate contracts and ensure smooth operations. Jim continued to outline the scope of the role, explaining that they needed someone who understood both sides of the automotive business, someone who had worked in dealerships and understood their challenges, but who could also think strategically about distribution networks and supplier relationships. The job would involve extensive travel, building relationships with dealer principals and service managers throughout the region. Most importantly, the position came with significant autonomy. I would be responsible for developing and implementing supply strategies for my entire territory with minimal oversight from the corporate office. Regional Auto Supply believed in empowering their regional distributors to make decisions based on their local market knowledge and relationships. I accepted the offer that same day. The next few weeks were a crash course in the supply side of the automotive business. I had always understood dealership operations from the customer-facing perspective, but now I was learning about the complex network of suppliers, distributors, and logistics companies that kept the entire industry running. I discovered that modern dealerships depended on dozens of different suppliers for everything from basic maintenance items to specialized diagnostic equipment, parts deliveries, service tools, even the coffee in the customer waiting areas. It all flowed through predictable channels that could be influenced by someone with the right knowledge and access. Regional Auto Supply had contracts with hundreds of dealerships across the Midwest, providing everything from brake pads and oil filters to computerized diagnostic systems and shop equipment. The company prided itself on reliability and customer service, values that aligned perfectly with my own business philosophy. My territory included 43 dealerships, ranging from small family operations like Morrison Motors to large corporate-owned facilities that sold multiple brands. Each dealership had its own unique needs and challenges, its own relationships with customers and suppliers, its own approach to balancing service quality with profitability. As I began visiting these dealerships and learning about their operations, I started to understand just how vulnerable Garrett's business really was. Morrison Family Motors depended on an intricate web of suppliers and service providers, relationships that had been built over decades but could be disrupted by seemingly minor changes in timing, pricing, or availability. I started small, with adjustments so subtle that they would seem like normal business fluctuations to anyone who wasn't looking for patterns. When Morrison Motors ordered spark plugs for their service department, their shipment might arrive a day late due to what appeared to be a routing error in the distribution system. When they needed brake rotors for a customer's repair, the price might have increased slightly due to apparent market fluctuations. None of these disruptions were dramatic enough to cause immediate crisis, but they created friction in Garrett's operation. Service appointments had to be rescheduled when parts didn't arrive on time. Profit margins were squeezed when replacement parts cost more than expected. Customers grew frustrated with delays and began questioning the dealership's reliability. Meanwhile, I was ensuring that other dealerships in my territory received exceptional treatment. Priority shipping, competitive pricing, technical support when needed. I made sure that Regional Auto Supply's other customers understood that they could depend on us for consistent professional service. Word spread quickly through the industry about our regional distributor and the kind of treatment dealers could expect. Other dealerships began specifically requesting to work with Regional Auto Supply because of the reputation we were building for reliability and customer focus. The contrast between Morrison Motors' experience and that of other dealerships in the region became increasingly apparent. While other dealers praised Regional Auto Supply's service and reliability, Garrett found himself dealing with a seemingly endless series of minor problems and frustrations. After the first month, Garrett started calling me. His voice had lost much of the confidence he had displayed during our final confrontation in his office. He explained that there had been some confusion with their supply orders, that parts were arriving late and prices seemed to be fluctuating unpredictably. He wondered if I might know what was causing these problems. I kept my voice neutral and professional when I responded, expressing sympathy for his difficulties while suggesting that supply chain management could be tricky, especially in a volatile market. I recommended that he reach out to his sales representative directly to address any specific concerns. When he complained that he kept getting passed around to different people and couldn't seem to get straight answers, I acknowledged that this sounded frustrating. I suggested that perhaps he needed to find a more reliable supply partner, someone who could provide the consistent service that a busy dealership required. There was a long silence on the other end of the line during that conversation. I could almost hear him thinking, trying to figure out if I was somehow involved in his problems. But I had been careful to keep my actions indirect, working through the normal channels of business operations rather than doing anything that could be traced directly back to me. The beauty of my position was that everything I did appeared to be standard business practice. Pricing adjustments, shipping delays, inventory allocation decisions. These were all normal parts of supply chain management, the kind of decisions that regional distributors made dozens of times each day based on market conditions and customer relationships. As weeks turned into months, Garrett's problems multiplied in ways that went far beyond my subtle interference. His aggressive sales tactics, which had initially shown promise with some quick wins, began to backfire spectacularly as customers realized they were being pressured rather than served. Mrs. Patterson was offended when one of Garrett's new salesmen tried to push her toward a more expensive model, questioning her stated preferences and suggesting that she didn't really understand what she needed. She had been buying cars from our family for over 20 years, and she wasn't accustomed to being treated like she didn't know her own mind. The Rodriguez family felt disrespected when Garrett questioned the creditworthiness of their small business, demanding additional documentation and references before approving their financing for a fleet purchase. They had been customers for over a decade, always paying their bills on time, and they couldn't understand why they were suddenly being treated with suspicion. Old Mr. Chen stopped coming to the dealership entirely after one of the new salespeople made it clear that browsers weren't welcome unless they were serious about making a purchase. The Saturday conversations that had been a highlight of his week and a source of valuable word-of-mouth advertising for us disappeared overnight. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic approach that Garrett had implemented based on his business school theories about customer segmentation and sales efficiency. He had trained his staff to identify and focus on high-value prospects while minimizing time spent on customers who were unlikely to generate significant revenue. The problem was that Garrett didn't understand how automotive sales really worked in a community-focused market like ours. Many of our most valuable customers didn't look like high-value prospects when they first walked through our doors. They were people who bought practical used cars and maintained them carefully, building relationships with our service department over years of regular maintenance visits. These customers generated steady revenue through service work, and more importantly, they referred friends and family members who trusted their recommendations. Mrs. Patterson had sent us at least a dozen customers over the years, and the Rodriguez family had recommended us to other small business owners who needed reliable commercial vehicles. By treating these relationship builders as low-priority prospects, Garrett was systematically dismantling the network of trust and referrals that had sustained the dealership for decades. He was optimizing for short-term transaction value while destroying the long-term relationships that generated sustainable profitability. But it was the supply chain problems that really began to cripple the dealership's operations. Service appointments had to be rescheduled repeatedly when parts didn't arrive as expected. Sales were lost when customers grew frustrated with delays in getting their new vehicles properly prepared for delivery. The dealership's reputation for reliability, built over decades of consistent performance, started to crumble as customers shared their negative experiences with friends and neighbors. In a tight-knit community like ours, word traveled fast when a trusted business began letting people down. I monitored all of this through my network of industry contacts and relationships with other dealers in my territory. Former Morrison Motors customers began appearing at other dealerships, and I made sure they received exceptional treatment that contrasted sharply with their recent experiences. The psychological impact of this contrast was powerful. Customers who had grown frustrated with delays and impersonal service at Morrison Motors found themselves welcomed warmly at other dealerships, where their needs were understood and their concerns were addressed promptly and professionally. Many of these customers made comments about how much better they were being treated compared to their previous experience, and these stories spread throughout the community like wildfire. The narrative that emerged was clear. Morrison Motors had changed for the worse, while other dealerships in the area were providing superior customer service. Garrett's desperation became more apparent with each passing month. He started offering deeper discounts to attract customers, cutting into profit margins that were already being squeezed by his supply chain problems and operational inefficiencies. He hired additional salespeople at higher commission rates, inflating his costs while struggling to generate enough revenue to justify the expense. He tried to negotiate better terms with suppliers, but his reputation was already damaged. Word had spread through the supplier network that Morrison Motors was having operational problems and struggling with customer retention. This made other suppliers reluctant to offer favorable terms, since they weren't confident that the dealership would be able to maintain steady order volumes. The situation created a vicious cycle. Operational problems led to customer dissatisfaction, which reduced sales volume, which made suppliers less willing to offer competitive terms, which increased costs and created more operational problems. I watched this downward spiral with a mixture of satisfaction and professional interest. Garrett had created most of these problems himself through his misguided approach to customer relations and business management, but my subtle interference had accelerated and amplified the natural consequences of his poor decisions. The breaking point came during the spring sales season, traditionally the busiest and most profitable time for automotive dealers. Garrett had planned an aggressive marketing campaign, promising customers immediate delivery and competitive pricing on a wide selection of new and used vehicles. The campaign was based on projections that assumed normal supplier performance and inventory availability. But when customers responded to his advertising and arrived at the dealership, they found a lot that was half empty and a service department that was backed up for weeks. Supply problems had left Garrett without adequate inventory to meet demand, while his service department was struggling with part shortages that made it impossible to complete repairs on schedule. Customers who had been promised immediate delivery were told they would have to wait weeks for their vehicles, while others who needed service work were given appointment dates that stretched far into the future. The disconnect between Garrett's marketing promises and his operational reality created a public relations disaster. Customers who had been excited about purchasing new vehicles became angry and disappointed when they realized that the dealership couldn't deliver on its commitments. Many of these customers shared their frustrations on social media and review websites, creating a permanent record of Morrison Motors' failure to meet expectations. The negative reviews and comments further damaged the dealership's reputation and made it even harder to attract new customers. I received another call from Garrett during this crisis, this time late at night when he was clearly exhausted and desperate. His voice was different than it had been during our previous conversations, less controlled, more vulnerable, tinged with an emotion that might have been fear. He told me directly that he knew I was behind his problems, that he didn't understand how I was doing it, but he was certain that I was somehow orchestrating the difficulties he was experiencing. The timing was too convenient, the problems too systematic to be mere coincidence. I let the silence stretch between us before responding, allowing the weight of his accusation to settle in the space between us. When I finally spoke, I told him that I didn't know what he was talking about, that I was simply doing my job as a regional distributor for regional auto supply. He pressed further, his voice becoming more agitated as he demanded to know what I wanted, what it would take to make the problem stop. There was desperation in his tone now, the sound of someone who had finally realized that he was in over his head. For the first time since our confrontation in his office, I allowed some of my anger to show in my voice. I told him that I wanted what had been mine, what I had earned through 16 years of dedication and hard work. I wanted the business back where it belonged, in the hands of people who understood its true value. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving both of us to contemplate the implications of what had been said. Garrett now knew for certain that I was involved in his troubles, but he still didn't understand exactly how I was doing it or what he could do to stop me. 2 weeks after that phone call, I received an unexpected contact from my father. At 78, he had officially retired from day-to-day operations several years earlier, but he still held controlling interest in Morrison Family Motors and maintained close relationships with several longtime employees who kept him informed about the dealership's condition. His voice was heavy with concern when he called, asking if we could meet to discuss the situation at the dealership. He had been watching the decline with growing alarm, he said, and he needed to understand what was really happening and what could be done to address it. I agreed to meet him at the old coffee shop where we used to have breakfast every Saturday morning before the dealership opened. Back when I was learning the business, and he was teaching me everything he knew about automotive sales and customer service. The coffee shop hadn't changed much over the years, still featuring the same red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor that had been there since the 1960s. But my father looked older than I remembered, the stress of watching his life's work crumble evident in the lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands as he stirred his coffee. He began by acknowledging that he had made a mistake, that he had allowed Garrett to convince him that dramatic changes were necessary for the dealership's survival. He had been swayed by presentations about market trends and competitive pressures, by arguments about the need to modernize operations and adopt more aggressive sales strategies. He told me that he should have listened to my concerns, should have recognized that my objections were based on deep understanding of our customers and our market rather than simple resistance to change. He had been impressed by Garrett's business school credentials and his confident presentations, but he now realized that academic knowledge wasn't a substitute for practical experience and genuine understanding of customer relationships. The dealership was hemorrhaging money now, he explained, with customer defections accelerating and operational problems creating a cascade of additional costs and complications. Garrett couldn't seem to figure out what was going wrong or how to fix it, and the staff was becoming increasingly demoralized as they watched the business deteriorate. My father looked at me directly then, his eyes still sharp despite his age, and asked if I was somehow involved in what was happening to the dealership. He didn't ask the question with accusation or anger, but with the kind of direct honesty that had always characterized our relationship. I met his gaze steadily, and told him that Garrett had made his choice when he fired me, that he had wanted to run the business his way without interference from what he considered outdated methods. I was simply allowing him to do exactly that, to experience the full consequences of his decisions without the safety net that my experience and relationships had provided. My father nodded slowly, understanding the implications of what I was telling him. He had built the dealership on principles of customer service and community relationships, and he knew better than anyone how fragile those relationships could be when they weren't properly maintained. He asked if I thought the situation could be salvaged, whether the damage that had been done could be repaired if the right changes were made. I told him that some of the damage was permanent. Customers who had been offended or disappointed might never return, and the dealership's reputation in the community would take years to fully restore. But I also told him that the fundamental strengths of the business were still there. The location was excellent, the facility was well maintained, and there were still employees who understood what the dealership had represented at its best. With the right leadership and approach, it might be possible to rebuild what had been lost. My father was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the street where he had conducted business for over 4 decades. When he spoke again, his voice was firm with the kind of resolve that had built Morrison Family Motors from a small used car lot into one of Chicago's most respected dealerships. He told me that he was going to take back active control of the dealership, that he was going to give Garrett a choice between stepping down gracefully to learn the business properly from the ground up, or being forced out entirely. Either way, he needed someone he could trust to help rebuild what had been damaged. He asked me directly if I would come home, if I would help him fix the mess that had been made of our family business. He told me that the dealership needed me, that he needed me, and that together we could restore Morrison Motors to what it had been and should be again. I felt a surge of satisfaction at his words, but I kept my expression neutral as I considered his offer. The opportunity for revenge had been satisfying, but the chance to rebuild something meaningful was far more appealing. I told him that I would need certain assurances about my role and authority, that I couldn't return only to face the same kind of interference that had led to the current crisis. He assured me that I would have full operational control, that Garrett would either accept a subordinate learning role or be removed from the business entirely. The dealership would return to the customer-focused approach that had made it successful, and I would have his complete support in implementing whatever changes were necessary. I accepted his offer that same afternoon. The restoration of Morrison Family Motors didn't happen overnight. It took months of careful, methodical work to rebuild the relationships that had been damaged and to restore the dealership's reputation in the community. But gradually, with patience and genuine commitment to customer service, we began to see signs of recovery. The first step was addressing the operational problems that had been plaguing the business. Supply chain issues mysteriously resolved themselves as I used my relationships with regional auto supply and other vendors to ensure reliable parts delivery and competitive pricing. Service appointments could be scheduled with confidence again, and customers began to trust that their vehicles would be ready when promised. We also had to rebuild relationships with customers who had been alienated by Garrett's aggressive sales approach. This required personal outreach, sincere apologies, and demonstrable changes in how we treated people who walked through our doors. Some customers were willing to give us another chance, while others had been too deeply offended to return immediately. Mrs. Patterson was among those who agreed to meet with me to discuss her concerns. She explained how hurt and insulted she had felt when the new salesman had questioned her judgment and tried to pressure her into buying something she didn't want. She had been a loyal customer for over 20 years, she said, and she couldn't understand how the dealership had changed so dramatically. I apologized sincerely for her experience and assured her that such treatment was completely contrary to our values and standards. I explained that we had made personnel changes and implemented new training programs to ensure that every customer was treated with the respect and consideration they deserved. She agreed to give us another opportunity to serve her, though she made it clear that we would need to earn back her trust through our actions rather than our words. When she eventually purchased her next vehicle from us 6 months later, it felt like a genuine victory, proof that damaged relationships could be repaired with patience and authentic commitment to change. The Rodriguez family required similar outreach and relationship rebuilding. They had been particularly offended by the questioning of their creditworthiness since they had maintained an excellent payment history with us for over a decade. The incident had made them feel like they were being treated as potential criminals rather than valued customers. I met with them personally to apologize and to review their account history, demonstrating that we valued their business and understood their reliability as customers. I also implemented new policies to ensure that long-term customers with established payment histories would never again be subjected to unnecessary scrutiny or documentation requirements. Rebuilding our relationship with the Rodriguez family was particularly important because of their connections within the local business community. They had referred several other small business owners to us over the years, and their endorsement carried significant weight among potential commercial customers. Old Mr. Chen proved to be one of our most challenging relationships to restore. He had been deeply hurt by the suggestion that he wasn't welcome unless he was serious about making a purchase, since his Saturday visits had been a cherished part of his weekly routine for years. I visited him at his home to apologize personally and to invite him back to the dealership. I assured him that his presence was valued regardless of whether he ever made another purchase, and that his knowledge and enthusiasm for automobiles made him a welcome guest at any time. It took several months before he felt comfortable returning to his Saturday routine, but when he did, his presence sent a clear signal to the community that Morrison Motors was returning to its roots as a business that valued relationships over transactions. Garrett's role in the restored dealership was necessarily limited. My father had given him the choice between accepting an entry-level position to learn the business properly or leaving entirely, and he had chosen to stay. This meant starting over in the service department under the supervision of experienced technicians, learning the fundamentals of customer service and automotive maintenance from the ground up. It was humbling for someone who had recently been running the entire operation. But Garrett seemed to understand that it was necessary if he ever wanted to earn back the trust and respect of his colleagues and customers. Whether he would ever truly grasp the principles that made the dealership successful remained to be seen. But at least he was making an effort to learn. The process of rebuilding Morrison Family Motors taught me valuable lessons about leadership, resilience, and the importance of staying true to core values, even when faced with pressure to change. Garrett's brief tenure as president had demonstrated what happened when short-term thinking and aggressive tactics replaced relationship building and customer focus. As the months passed, I found myself back in the office that had been my second home. The mahogany desk felt earned rather than inherited. Morrison Family Motors began to thrive again as customers returned for the relationships we offered. Garrett had tried to erase 16 years of my life. He learned that actions have consequences. As I locked up each night, I knew we had not just survived, we had emerged stronger.